Hey there, and welcome. Tonight, we step back into one of the most glittering and terrifying courts in all of history, the court of King Henry VIII. On the surface, it was a place of dazzling pageantry. Imagine vast halls hung with tapestries, candlelight flickering across golden chalices, courtiers dressed in silks and velvets, music drifting through chambers perfumed with roses and spices from far-off lands. To the outside world, it was the very image of magnificence and power. But behind the glitter, there was danger. For those who lived and served within Henry's orbit, life was a performance on a knife's edge. Every word, every bow, every smile had meaning. The wrong glance at the wrong time could spark suspicion. A careless laugh, an expression of doubt, or even a smile that seemed misplaced could lead to whispers of disloyalty. And in a world where the king's favor was everything, even whispers could cost you your life. This was a court where power was intoxicating but deadly, where ambition burned brightly but could end in ashes and blood. Great men and women rose high, only to fall suddenly and violently when fortune shifted. Wives, ministers, nobles, none were safe from the king's temper, or from the political intrigues that swirled like a storm beneath the glittering surface. So tonight, we will walk the shadowed halls of Henry VIII's court together. We'll see how courtiers balanced on the edge of survival, how the smallest mistake could spiral into disaster, and why history remembers this era as both magnificent and merciless. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's step inside the Tudor court, where even a smile could cost you your head. Imagine stepping through the grand gates of Whitehall, palace on a frost-bitten morning in the 1530s. The sun is rising sluggishly over London, casting pale gold across the Thames, and already the air hums with whispers. The palace is alive long before the king himself. Servants rush along galleries with trays of food and ewers of wine. Scribes carry stacks of parchment, and musicians tune their lutes in preparation for whatever spectacle Henry VIII demands that day. But for all its glitter and pomp, Whitehall is not a safe place. It is a stage dressed in velvet and gold leaf, where even the most fleeting expression, a smile, a glance, a word uttered too quickly, can mean the difference between climbing to fortune or tumbling headlong into ruin. Here, life is a performance, and everyone, from the lowest servant to the highest noble, plays their role under the watchful, ever-suspicious eyes of a king who holds life and death in his hands. The scent of roasting meats mingles with beeswax and perfumes heavy enough to mask the stench of sweat, sickness, and fear. Every corridor gleams with tapestries, showing battles, saints, and triumphs, reminders of both power and divine right. Yet beneath these displays lies something far more sinister. The murmur of courtiers plotting their next move, the guarded silence of men who know one word might be repeated in the wrong ear. This is why contemporaries called it not just a palace, but a labyrinth of whispers. To the outsider, it seems like paradise. The court glitters with gold chains, jewel-studded gowns, and feasts where venison, swan, and sweetmeats are laid out in abundance. Music floats from the great halls, laughter from the chambers of nobles, and the king himself strides through it all like a lion broad-shouldered, red-haired, dressed in silks and fur, dripping with rings. Henry is every inch the monarch of magnificence, and his court reflects that magnificence back to him. But the splendor hides the truth. Every glittering surface masks the cold steel of suspicion. Every laugh is measured. Every smile is a gamble. For here in Henry's court, to smile wrong is to court disaster. To appear too smug in victory, too eager in favor, or even too indifferent in the king's presence, could mark you out as arrogant, untrustworthy, or disloyal. Courtiers lived in constant awareness of how they were seen, not just by Henry, but by his advisors, his wives, his enemies, and the countless spies that moved like shadows among the velvet curtains. Consider this. One day you are invited to share the king's table. You bow, you smile, you flatter. He laughs at your joke and claps you on the shoulder. The entire court sees it your star is rising. But the very next day, perhaps you laugh too loudly, or smile too long in the direction of the wrong lady, or murmur something in confidence that reaches the king's ear in twisted form. Suddenly, you are no longer the king's favorite, but his enemy. And in Henry's world, enemies rarely lived long. It was said that the walls themselves had ears. This was not mere superstition. Spies and informants worked the palace like veins under flesh, carrying whispers to men like Thomas Cromwell, who built power on secrets. Even servants might trade gossip for coin, and one overheard word could mean the end of a dynasty. Whispers condemned Anne Boleyn. Whispers damned Thomas More. Whispers sent nobles to the scaffold, their heads rolling onto straw as the court looked on in silence. And so the court learned to live in this theater of survival. Smiles became masks, laughter became currency, and silence itself was sometimes the wisest performance. The king wanted beauty, splendor, and charm, but he also demanded absolute loyalty, absolute submission, and absolute fear. Those who misjudged the balance quickly discovered how sharp the axe at Tower Hill truly was. If you stood in one of the great halls, surrounded by glittering courtiers, it might be easy to forget the fear at first. The music would swell. A masque would begin, dancers in gilded masks weaving between torches. Ladies in gowns of crimson and emerald would laugh, fans fluttering like wings. Henry himself might appear at any moment, perhaps in disguise to test his courtiers, or perhaps in all his royal magnificence, ready to single out a favorite with a nod or a jest. But even here, in this apparent joy, danger lurked. If you danced too gracefully with the wrong woman, suspicion of an affair could arise. If your poetry seemed too clever, it might be twisted into sedition. If your smile lingered too long, it could be seen as mockery or worse, ambition. This was the paradox of Henry VIII's court, a place of dazzling magnificence where every gesture was a calculated risk. Nobles, scholars, poets, and soldiers all learned to wear masks of charm, but beneath those masks lay hearts that beat with anxiety. Each feast, each mask, each gathering was not only entertainment, it was a battlefield where reputation was won or lost, often in the silence between words. The king himself thrived on this atmosphere. Henry was not merely a monarch, but a master manipulator who delighted in keeping his courtiers guessing. He gave favor lavishly and stripped it away mercilessly. To be smiled upon by Henry was to bask in glory. To lose that smile was to shiver in the shadow of the scaffold. And so, the palace thronged with whispers of alliances, betrayals, love affairs, religious debates, and endless speculation over who might rise or fall next. The very stones seemed to absorb these murmurs, until the place felt alive with them, a breathing organism made of secrets. Life in the court was a constant performance on the edge of a blade. Men and women adorned themselves in silks, perfumes, and jewels, but beneath the glamour was raw survival. A wrong glance could condemn you. A misplaced smile could end your life. Welcome, then, to Henry VIII's court. A palace of splendor, yes, but more than that. A palace of whispers. The court of Henry VIII was not merely a palace. It was the sun around which the entire realm revolved. To be close to the king was to bask in warmth, in privilege, in riches that few in the world could dream of. Nobles, courtiers, ambassadors, and hopeful young men all yearned for his glance, his word, his smile. Yet, just as the sun can burn, Henry's favor could scorch those who presumed too much or failed to hold it. Proximity to Henry was both the greatest gift and the most perilous burden, for in that world everything wealth. Survival, even breath itself, depended on whether one stood in the glow of the king's approval or was cast into the abyss of his displeasure. Those who rose in Henry's court rose quickly. It was a dazzling ladder that could transform an unknown man into a duke, a pauper into a lord. Thomas Wolsey, for instance, was not born into nobility. He was the son of a butcher, an unthinkable background for someone who would later become Cardinal Wolsey, Chancellor of England, and the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Yet, he understood Henry's needs, his desires, his impatience with delay. Wolsey worked tirelessly to please the king, smoothing away difficulties and making himself indispensable. For a time, his influence was greater than any nobleman's. He was not merely serving Henry, he was ruling in his name. But the ladder that carried him so high was fragile, balanced on the temper of a king whose moods shifted like storm clouds. When Wolsey could not deliver Henry's desired annulment from Catherine of Aragon, his fall was inevitable. Once the most powerful man in England, he was stripped of his titles, forced into exile, and narrowly escaped execution, only by dying of illness on the way to trial. Such was the game at Henry's court. Rise high on his favor, and you soared like an eagle. Lose it, and you plummeted like a stone into the gallows or the axe. The courtiers who surrounded Henry knew this truth in their bones. Their laughter, their praise, their obedience were not just etiquette, they were survival. To catch the king's eye at a feast, to share a jest that made him chuckle, to anticipate his wish before he spoke it, these were not mere acts of courtesy, but lifelines. One had to shine without outshining, to be loyal without seeming servile, to stand near him without appearing presumptuous. It was a delicate dance on a blade's edge. Consider Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most famous of Henry's favorites. She captivated him with her wit, her charm, and her refusal to surrender easily. While others bent swiftly to the king's will, Anne withheld herself, and in doing so, enticed him more. For years, Henry showered her with gifts, titles, and promises. He tore apart his kingdom and his church to marry her. Anne became queen, crowned, and adored, or so it seemed. But her power was nothing more than the reflection of Henry's desire. The moment she failed to give him what he craved, and ere her fate was sealed, her enemies whispered, her rivals circled, and when Henry's affection cooled, no crown could save her. She was tried for adultery, incest, and treason, her name blackened, her body condemned. Once the most powerful woman in England, she was executed by sword on Henry's orders, her life extinguished as swiftly as it had been exalted. Every man and woman in Henry's orbit understood this terrible truth. His favor was life, his displeasure death. A smile from him was a blessing. A frown was a sentence. Even Henry's closest friends were not safe. Take Sir Thomas More, the brilliant scholar and statesman. Henry admired him deeply, making him Lord Chancellor after Wolsey's fall. More was respected across Europe for his intellect and integrity. Yet when Henry demanded that More accept him as head of the Church of England, More's conscience would not bend. He would not swear the oath. To Henry, this was not mere defiance, it was betrayal. And betrayal, no matter how principled, could not be tolerated. More was imprisoned in the Tower and ultimately executed, his head displayed on a pike. His brilliance, his years of service, his closeness to the king all counted for nothing when he fell out of favor. The same fate haunted courtiers like Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's right hand. Cromwell was a master manipulator, orchestrating reforms, engineering Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, and reshaping England's political landscape. But when that marriage failed, and Henry felt mocked by the Queen's appearance, Cromwell bore the blame. Overnight, the man who had ruled England through Henry's authority was condemned as a traitor. Dragged to execution, he met the same end as so many before him. The lesson was clear. Henry's favor could build empires, but it could not be stored, nor could it be counted on. It was as unstable as his temper, as fleeting as his passions. One day you might dine beside him, laughter filling the hall. The next, you might find yourself locked in the Tower, awaiting a trial whose outcome was already decided. Foreign ambassadors, too, tread this line with trembling steps. They brought gifts, whispered secrets, and bent their words like reeds in the wind, all in the hope of swaying Henry's ear. For to win the king's confidence was to win England's power on the international stage. Yet a misstep, a word too sharp or too cautious, and their embassy could collapse, their safety imperiled. They walked into the chamber of a man whose word was law, whose moods were storms, and whose memory for insults was long and merciless. The glittering splendor of Henry's court, the gold-threaded tapestries, the banquets laden with swans and venison, the masks of music and dance masked, a truth everyone knew but never spoke aloud. All of it was for the king, and all of it depended on his whims. A nod from him might bring titles, manners, and untold wealth. A scowl might erase a family's name from the rolls of nobility. And so the courtiers smiled, they bowed, they laughed when Henry laughed, and grew silent when his temper darkened. They learned to watch his eyes, to measure the tremor in his voice, to read his very breath for hints of favor or danger. Because in Henry VIII's England, survival was not about talent or bloodline alone. It was about proximity to the king's heart and the willingness to live and sometimes die by his favor. Would you like me to continue expanding this section until it reaches the full 3,000 words, weaving in more detailed daily court life, specific examples of those who rose and fell, and the psychological weight of living under Henry's gaze? Under the vaulted ceilings of Hampton Court, where torches flickered against golden tapestries, every gesture mattered more than words. To live in Henry VIII's court was to exist in a world where a smile might save you, or just as easily condemn you. Nobles walked with careful steps, their bodies angled in rehearsed deference, their eyes lowered at just the right time, their mouths curved in cautious half-smiles, meant to please, but never to presume. Every day was a performance, and the king was the only audience who mattered. He might laugh at a jest one morning and call it insolence the next. A bow that dipped too low might appear mocking, while one that was not deep enough might reek of arrogance. In the hushed halls of the palace, silence itself was dangerous, but words were more dangerous still. The courtiers knew this truth too well. Behind the silks and perfumes, their stomachs churned with fear. A misplaced look could be the spark of suspicion, and suspicion was death in waiting. When Henry's eyes fell upon you, it was not only his gaze you felt, but the crushing weight of judgment. His moods shifted like storms, sudden and violent, and no one could predict which way the wind would blow. One day he might embrace a courtier, drape an arm over their shoulder, call them friend. The next, that same man might be dragged to the Tower, accused of treason for a glance that lingered too long upon the Queen, or for laughter that seemed to mock the king's pain. The game was rigged, and everyone played it with trembling hands. Smiling was the most treacherous act of all. It seemed such a small thing, a turn of the lips, a flash of teeth. But in Henry's court, it was a blade disguised as courtesy. Smile too widely, and you looked insincere, as if mocking him. Smile too faintly, and you appeared cold, disrespectful, perhaps even plotting. Women of the court mastered the art of the careful smile, lips curved just enough to flatter, but never enough to invite jealousy. Men practiced in mirrors, ensuring their expressions conveyed loyalty, but not arrogance. It was a theater where every player knew the stakes. One false smile could mean a head on the block. Stories whispered through the corridors of courtiers, undone by such mistakes. A noblewoman who smirked too boldly at Henry's jest found herself accused of laughing at the king rather than with him. A courtier whose bow was accompanied by a smile Henry deemed sly was soon accused of plotting, his land seized, his body rotting beneath Tower walls. Even Anne Boleyn, once adored, knew how fragile a smile could be. Her charm, her wit, her daring glances, all of it that once drew Henry to her, eventually turned against her. Where once he saw flirtation, he later saw mockery, betrayal. And so, a queen who had captivated a monarch with her smile was condemned to die by the edge of an executioner's sword. The courtiers learned to smile, not with joy, but with fear. They smiled to survive. Behind their expressions hid clenched jaws, biting back words that could never be spoken. They bowed with aching spines, their bodies breaking under the weight of ritual. The air of the court was perfumed with roses and incense, but beneath it was the stench of dread. Each feast, each dance, each performance was haunted by the possibility that tonight someone's smile would be their undoing. Even in moments of supposed leisure, the danger lingered. At masques and tournaments, where laughter filled the air, and Henry showed himself as both king and sportsman, the courtiers' smiles were masks. Applause had to be just loud enough, admiration just bright enough, but never overdone. A lord who cheered too eagerly for Henry's opponent risked offending the king. A lady who gazed too long at the joust might be accused of favoring another man's strength over Henry's. The game was endless, exhausting, and merciless. And yet they played, because to stop playing meant exile or worse. To walk in Henry's world was to carry a constant awareness of one's own body, every tilt of the head, every glance of the eye, every twitch of the mouth. Smiles were weapons, bows were shields, and silence was a noose. Even the act of breathing seemed measured, lest it disturb the delicate balance between life and death. And always, at the center of it all, stood Henry the sun around which all courtiers revolved, their fates burning or freezing, depending on how warmly he chose to shine. In the glittering rooms filled with gold and music, beneath the towering arches of palaces that seemed eternal, death lurked in the smallest of details. It did not come with sword or arrow, but with the flick of a gaze, the misinterpretation of a smile, the suspicion buried in a bow. And so the courtiers smiled, endlessly, desperately, knowing that at any moment their performance could end, and the final curtain would fall in the shadow of the executioner's axe. The court of Henry VIII was less a home of governance and more a theater of survival. Every hall, every chamber, every polished floor was a stage upon which men and women played parts, their gestures rehearsed, their words sharpened, their very smiles weighed with careful intent. Those who thrived were those who understood this performance, not as play, but as necessity. A theater where the cost of a misstep was not a missed applause, but the loss of one's head. The courtiers, adorned in velvet and jewels, appeared radiant, but beneath their silks beat hearts strained by endless rehearsal, a constant awareness that every look could mean advancement or ruin. Flattery was not merely a habit, it was a currency. A compliment well placed, a bow delivered with just the right mixture of reverence and warmth, a phrase repeated back to the king in a way that suggested admiration rather than imitation. These were the coins of survival. Yet unlike coins, they had to be spent again and again, each day requiring new performances. A courtier could not rely on yesterday's wit or last week's devotion. The performance expired with the passing of each sun. Henry demanded fresh displays of loyalty, renewed proof of devotion, and courtiers understood that his eye was ever roving, searching for cracks in the facade. A paranoia bred by such a life was suffocating. Men and women measured each word not only for how Henry might receive it, but for how others might twist it. A careless aside about the cost of war, a sigh after the king's jest, an eye roll barely perceptible to one. These could be reported by a rival eager to gain ground. The walls had ears, and the court was filled with whisperers who thrived on feeding suspicions to the throne. And so the courtiers rehearsed, not just before approaching Henry, but even in their private chambers, practicing bows, refining their smiles, testing the tones of their voices. A misjudged tone could be as fatal as a drawn sword. In this theater, rivalry sharpened into performance art. A man might spend hours crafting the perfect phrase of admiration, yet deliver it as though it had sprung unbidden from his lips. A woman might practice the angle of her curtsy in secret, aware that even an extra second of hesitation could suggest arrogance. To exist in such a place was to be endlessly vigilant, never truly oneself, always adjusting the mask. It was less a court and more a carnival of shadows, where the brightest faces often hid the darkest fears. The spectacle extended beyond survival into deliberate displays of loyalty. Courtiers staged their devotion in public, flattering not only with words, but with actions. Some showered Henry with costly gifts, tokens of wealth meant to reinforce their loyalty. Others whispered rumors about rivals, ensuring that the king's suspicion turned outward rather than inward. Banquets, dances, and tournaments were not simply entertainments. They were arenas of subtle competition, stages where every glance, every bow, every movement had meaning. The richest velvet cloak, the most elaborate dance step, the boldest display of laughter at the king's jest, all these could elevate or endanger. Over time, the constant need for display blurred the line between genuine feeling and performance. Courtiers forgot where their true selves ended and their roles began. They became actors so deeply embedded in their parts that even in private, paranoia dictated their speech. Some spoke in half-sentences, fearful that even servants might carry tailies. Others learned to mask every flicker of thought upon their faces, cultivating expressions of bland devotion. The court became a hall of mirrors, where no one trusted what they saw, and everyone suspected that behind the laughter and the compliments lay treachery. Flattery itself became a dangerous game. Too little, and one risked seeming cold, ungrateful, or arrogant. Too much, and one risked being mocked as insincere or manipulative. Henry was not a fool. He enjoyed devotion, but he also despised those who fawned too obviously. Thus, the performance had to walk a knife's edge, balancing on the thin line between admiration and obsequiousness. Courtiers studied not only Henry's moods, but each other's techniques, watching how a phrase of praise landed, how a jest was received, how a gesture lingered in the king's memory. They mimicked what worked and discarded what did not, a constant rehearsal of the delicate art of survival. This atmosphere bred not only paranoia, but a strange kind of artistry. The court became a theater of masks, and courtiers its unwilling actors, perfecting roles that no playwright could have scripted better. Survival depended on improvisation within the rigid framework of deference. One could not control Henry's moods, but one could learn to sense them before they shifted. A wrong smile today might cost a man his life, but a well-timed bow tomorrow could restore his favor. In such a world, performance was not deceit, but necessity, the very air they breathed. Yet beneath the velvet, the jewels, and the polished rituals, the courtiers knew the truth. They were all performers in a play where the director was unpredictable, and the stage could collapse at any moment. Henry was not a passive audience. He was a dangerous participant, his reactions shaping the story, his whims rewriting the script. Courtiers feared that no amount of rehearsal could save them if the king decided to recast them out of favor, out of sight, or out of life entirely. The culture of spectacle, paranoia, and performance in Henry's court did not simply reflect his rule. It was his rule. Power lay not only in swords and laws, but in the subtle theater of everyday survival. And so, the courtiers played their parts, smiling carefully, bowing deeply, flattering artfully, knowing that the play had no end but death or exile. The stage was set, the performance eternal, and the stakes higher than any theater beyond those gilded walls. The court of Henry VIII was never a place of stability, and at the heart of this unpredictability was the king himself. Henry was no ordinary monarch who adhered strictly to tradition or protocol in his daily behavior. He was mercurial, shifting moods with frightening speed, and it was this temperament that kept his courtiers constantly off balance. To serve him was to live on the edge of a cliff, never certain whether today's smile would be met with laughter or with a glare that could spell ruin. The grandeur of his throne, his gilded chambers, and the lavish feasts might have dazzled those who entered, but beneath the glitter lay a man whose whims could alter the fates of entire families in a heartbeat. His courtiers, ambitious though they were, lived in a state of heightened tension, trained to read every flicker of expression on the king's face, to predict storms before they broke, though often the thunder came without warning. Henry could be magnificently generous. He was known to shower favorites with lands, titles, and jewels for the simplest acts of loyalty or clever flattery. A small word spoken at the right time could open the doors to wealth beyond measure. Those who pleased him might find themselves invited to his hunts, seated beside him at feasts, or rewarded with honors that changed the trajectory of their family's fortunes forever. Yet the same lips that smiled could suddenly twist with suspicion. The same hand that bestowed gifts could sign a death warrant with equal ease. To live near Henry was to live in a paradox. The closer you stood to the center of power, the brighter the light, but the hotter the flames. This volatility was magnified by the king's growing insecurities. In his youth, Henry had been celebrated for his vigor, athleticism, and charm. He was tall, handsome, and powerful, embodying the very ideal of a Renaissance prince. But as the years wore on, his health began to deteriorate. An old jousting injury left him with a festering leg wound that never properly healed, causing him constant pain and frustration. His once athletic body grew heavy, his movements slower, and with these physical changes came a restless anger. The frustration of a man who once commanded his body, but now felt betrayed by it, found its outlet in bursts of rage, directed at those who surrounded him. Courtiers were forced to absorb these tempests, smiling even when they feared their necks were in danger. Perhaps the most terrifying part of Henry's temper was its unpredictability. There were monarchs in history who were consistently cruel, where one knew what to expect, however grim. But Henry's duality, the blend of charm and savagery, kept his court in perpetual suspense. One day he could be joking with a courtier, clapping them on the shoulder, even calling them friend. The next day, that same person might be accused of treason or heresy, dragged to the Tower, and never seen again. This instability was not merely a matter of personal cruelty. It was a strategy of power. A king whose emotions were unpredictable kept his courtiers pliant, desperate to remain in his favor, constantly striving to guess his desires before he even spoke them. Fear and favor worked together, binding the court in a net of dependency. The women of Henry's life experienced the sharpest edge of this mercurial nature. His wives, each at first adored, quickly discovered the peril of his shifting heart. Catherine of Aragon, his queen for 2 decades, was once deeply respected and honored, yet when Henry's desire for Anne Boleyn consumed him, Catherine was cast aside, left humiliated and stripped of her rightful title. Anne herself, who once held Henry's devotion so completely that he altered the religious landscape of England for her, soon discovered the precariousness of that passion. When her charms no longer soothed his ego, his adoration curdled into suspicion and hatred, ending with her execution. Jane Seymour, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, each of them felt the instability of a man whose moods governed their lives. In private chambers and grand halls alike, the queen was never safe from the sudden chill of Henry's anger. For courtiers, the king's temper was not only a personal danger, but a political weapon. Those who opposed him, or who were merely caught in the crossfire of his shifting affections, could find themselves branded enemies of the crown without any true offense. The fall of Thomas More, once one of Henry's most trusted advisers, illustrates this perfectly. More's refusal to bend to Henry as will on matters of religion was intolerable to a king whose mood could not withstand defiance. Once praised and cherished, More was condemned, his execution serving as both punishment and warning. Similarly, Thomas Cromwell, who rose to great heights by anticipating Henry's wishes, eventually found himself discarded and destroyed when the king's favor turned against him. Henry's wrath could obliterate even those who had served him with tireless loyalty. Those who survived longest in Henry's court were the ones who mastered the art of constant vigilance. They knew how to flatter without overstepping, how to advise without contradicting, how to mirror the king's moods while hiding their own. A slip of the tongue could be forgiven one day, but on another it might be taken as an insult so grave that it spelled a man's undoing. Even silence could be dangerous, for Henry might see in it disapproval or conspiracy. Courtiers learned to move through the palace like dancers on a stage, attuned to the smallest shifts in the music of Henry's temper. The king's rages were legendary. He could shout until his face turned crimson, veins straining at his temples, his words laced with insults and threats. Objects could be thrown, doors slammed, courtiers banished from his presence with a gesture. The palace would tremble with the sound of his fury, and everyone within hearing distance would hold their breath, wondering who would feel its sharpest edge. And yet, just as quickly, the storm might pass. Henry could laugh heartily at just moments after bellowing in anger, leaving those around him disoriented, unsure whether to relax or remain tense. It was this whiplash of emotion that created the atmosphere of dread. In many ways, Henry's temper was not just a personal trait, but a reflection of the age in which he ruled. Power was fragile, even for kings. Rebellions, religious upheaval, and shifting alliances with foreign powers kept the realm in constant flux. Henry's inner instability mirrored the outer instability of his kingdom, and his court bore the brunt of both. Courtiers understood that their lives were tied not only to their own actions, but to the tides of the king's moods, tides as uncontrollable as the sea. For those who lived in his presence, the fear was not only of physical harm, but of the slow erosion of self. To spend years pretending, watching every word, every expression, was to lose a part of oneself to the performance demanded by survival. Some became hollowed by the effort, their true thoughts buried so deep they almost forgot them. Others became masterful actors, chameleons who blended seamlessly with the king's ever-changing demands. Though such skill carried its own dangers, envy, suspicion, or simple fatigue. In the end, Henry's temper was both his weapon and his weakness. It secured his dominance, ensuring that all who surrounded him were too fearful to defy him outright. Yet it also left a trail of broken trust, of courtiers and queens alike destroyed not by treason or rebellion, but by the shifting moods of one man. To live in Henry's court was to live in constant suspense, waiting for the next smile or the next storm, never knowing which would come. It was this unpredictability that made his reign both dazzling and terrifying, a theater of power in which every actor feared the wrath of the king, who held all their lives in his hands. The court of Henry VIII was a glittering theater, but behind the silks and jewels lurked a vicious game of shadows. It was not enough to please the king with bows, smiles, and words. To survive, one had to also outmaneuver the other courtiers, who circled him like hawks around prey. These men and women were not just companions to the king. They were rivals for his ear, for his purse, for his fleeting affections. In this world, survival meant understanding that danger came not only from the throne, but from the person whispering beside you at the banquet table. Rivals existed in every corridor, hiding their daggers behind courtesy and laughter. A misplaced smile, a joke that landed wrong, even the appearance of closeness with the king could be enough to spark jealousy, and jealousy was a powerful weapon. To sit near Henry at a feast, or to hand him a goblet, was not just a moment of honor. It was a signal to others that you were gaining ground. Those watching from the shadows would not let that stand without a fight. The rise of one courtier often meant the fall of another, and the downfall could be deadly. Consider the fate of Thomas Cromwell, once the king's most trusted servant. He was brilliant, cunning, and ruthless, building his power carefully and with skill. For years, he outmaneuvered noble rivals, placing himself closer and closer to Henry. But when he arranged Henry's ill-fated marriage to Anne of Cleves, those same rivals saw their opening. They whispered that Cromwell had tricked the king, that he mocked him behind his back. Their words fanned the flames of Henry's embarrassment until the king turned cold. In July 1540, Cromwell was led to the Tower, stripped of all titles, and executed. His enemies smiled in triumph, though only days later they too worried which shadow might be cast over them next. This was the pattern of Henry's court. Every time one man or woman rose in influence, others gathered in the dark corners to plot their undoing. It was rarely an open attack. Instead, it was a whisper to the king that someone had grown too proud. It was an accusation that a glance between two people suggested treasonous love. It was a quiet reminder of a slip of the tongue, retold until it became dangerous. Rivals did not need evidence. They needed only to feed Henry's suspicion, which was always near the surface. Smiles themselves could be weapons. To smile too warmly at the wrong person might suggest an alliance. To smile too little could suggest contempt. Courtiers watched one another constantly, looking for the tiniest slip to report. A woman's lowered eyes might be spun as a secret, a man's hesitation as guilt. In this way, rivals sharpened their knives, not with steel, but with interpretations. Each action was reimagined and retold, twisted into a threat. The factions at court deepened this constant danger. Noble families aligned with one another, forming fragile groups that shifted with Henry's mood. One week, the Seymours might rise as Jane Seymour or the king a son. The next, the Howards pressed forward through Anne Boleyn's influence. Those outside the circle of favor whispered and plotted, waiting for a stumble. When Anne Boleyn failed to give Henry a son, her enemies used every gesture and word against her. They claimed her laughter at court was too free, her glances at men too bold. These whispers, fanned by jealous rivals, turned into charges of adultery and treason. Her fall was swift and bloody, while her enemies moved into her chambers before the blood had dried on the scaffold. No one was safe, because rivals did not forget. Old grudges could surface years later when an enemy sensed weakness. Thomas More had once been admired as a man of principle and intelligence, but when he refused to accept Henry as head of the church, his enemies reminded the king of every hesitation, every doubt. What had once been overlooked as conscience became dangerous when framed as defiance. He was executed, his rivals watching with cold satisfaction, knowing their own places were safer, at least for that season. Life at court became a constant performance, not only for Henry, but for those who competed with one another. You had to smile when others triumphed, even if their success meant your own decline. You had to laugh at jokes while quietly listening for cracks in your rival's armor. Banquets, tournaments, even church services became stages where rivals sought to outshine or undermine. A faltering step in a dance, a slurred line in a mask, or a poorly chosen toast could be magnified into a fatal flaw. The paranoia was endless. Even friendships were dangerous. Too close a bond could be turned into evidence of conspiracy. Rivals were quick to accuse groups of secret councils, whispering of plots that may never have existed. Henry's court was littered with men and women accused, not because of crimes, but because someone else wanted them gone. Once accused, it was nearly impossible to escape suspicion. Rivals understood this, and they wielded it like a blade in the dark. What made this rivalry so vicious was the prize at stake, the king himself. To have Henry's ear meant access to wealth, lands, and titles. It meant the ability to shape laws, marriages, wars. One whisper to Henry could build a kingdom, while another could destroy it. This made courtiers desperate, willing to do anything to keep rivals at bay. Some flattered, some bribed, some seduced, but all feared the same thing, that while they were speaking, someone else was whispering in the king's other ear. The king's mood only fed the rivalries. Because Henry was mercurial, favor shifted constantly. Rivals learned to wait. They knew today's favorite could be tomorrow's victim. They did not need to strike immediately. They simply needed to survive long enough for the king's temper to turn. Then, with one well-placed word, they could push their rival into the abyss. In this way, the court consumed itself, a cycle of rise and fall, smile and betrayal. Imagine the tension of waking each morning, wondering whether your rival had already whispered against you in the night. Imagine entering the great hall and seeing a glance exchanged across the table, not knowing whether it meant friendship or doom. Every laugh, every toast, every bow carried weight. To be careless was to die, but to be too cautious was also suspicious. This was the trap rivals set for each other. There was no way to win, only ways to delay defeat. Even Henry himself sometimes seemed entertained by these rivalries, encouraging factions to compete. By setting one against another, he ensured no single courtier grew strong enough to threaten him. But this also meant he thrived on their destruction. He let them whisper, accuse, and scheme, then decided whose head would roll. The rivals in the shadows did the work of hunting each other, while Henry sat at the center, amused and enraged in equal measure. The result was a court drenched in paranoia. Smiles could kill, laughter could betray, glances could doom. Rivals lurked behind velvet curtains, beneath jeweled masks, waiting to strike with words sharper than swords. For all the grandeur of Henry VIII's reign, the truth was simple. His court was not just ruled by the king, but by the shadows cast by those desperate to survive within it. Anne Boleyn's story is one of the most haunting examples of how the glittering promise of Henry VIII's court could turn into a deadly trap. For a time, she stood as the most powerful woman in England, crowned queen, her wit and allure unmatched, her very smile enough to change the course of history. Yet in the same palace where she had once dazzled courtiers and meant the will of the king himself, her charm and sharpness eventually painted her as a threat. To understand her fall, one must imagine the atmosphere of the Tudor court, where love and politics intertwined so dangerously, and where a smile warm knowing or misplaced could be seen as ambition, betrayal, or treason. Anne first rose not because she was the most beautiful woman at court, but because she was different. While other women played their roles quietly, Anne was clever, quick-witted, and unafraid to spar with men in conversation. She had a sharp tongue that could amuse or sting, and Henry was enthralled. He found her laughter intoxicating, her teasing a game that challenged his ego. For years, she kept him waiting, refusing to give herself fully to him until marriage. That restraint only deepened his obsession, and soon he was willing to defy the Pope, the Church, and centuries of tradition to make her his wife. The court whispered endlessly about Anne, some admiring her boldness, others whispering that she bewitched the king. But whether she was loved or despised, all watched her rise with a mixture of fascination and dread. Her coronation was a spectacle of gold and velvet, yet even in that moment of triumph, danger lurked beneath the pageantry. Many nobles resented her, seeing her not as a rightful queen, but as the usurper who displaced the pious and beloved Catherine of Aragon. Others, clinging to the Catholic faith, saw Anne as the living embodiment of England's break with Rome. And yet, in the early days of her reign, Anne's star seemed unshakable. Henry lavished her with gifts, jewels, and affection. She gave him Elizabeth, a healthy daughter, and promised more children to come. She smiled at the courtiers, presided over feasts, and for a time it appeared her place was secure. But in Henry's court, security was always an illusion. The cracks began to show with her pregnancies. Anne miscarried more than once, and with each loss, her position grew weaker. Henry, who had moved heaven and earth to marry her, began to look elsewhere for comfort, and for the son he so desperately wanted. The court, ever watchful, noticed his wandering gaze and his cooling affection. For Anne, whose survival depended on keeping the king's attention, this shift was fatal. Her sharp wit, once a source of delight, now began to grate on Henry's temper. What had been playful banter turned into quarrels. A smile that once charmed now seemed like mockery. A glance toward another man became, in the eyes of her enemies, proof of infidelity. Those enemies were many, and they were patient. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, grew to despise her as their political ambitions collided. Courtiers who had always favored Catherine, or who feared Anne's influence, whispered rumors, weaving stories of her vanity, cruelty, and dangerous ambition. The smallest gestures became evidence. If she smiled too brightly at a court musician, it was called seduction. If she laughed in private with her brother, it was twisted into something monstrous. The court, a place of endless performance, turned against her, and every movement, every glance, was studied not as the actions of a queen, but as potential sins against the crown. Henry's temper, as ever, determined her fate. Once he was convinced, whether by true belief or by convenient persuasion, that Anne had betrayed him, there was no saving her. Her enemies acted quickly, gathering supposed confessions from frightened men, dragging her friends and even her brother into accusations of treason and adultery. Anne, proud and fearless, did not crumble. At her trial, she defended herself with dignity, even brilliance. But her words were powerless against the machinery of power that had already decided her fate. The jury was stacked with her enemies. The king's will loomed over all, and no smile or tear could sway the outcome. The day of her execution was cold and merciless. She dressed with care, wearing a gown of dark velvet, and walked with poise to the scaffold built within the Tower of London. The very place where she had once been celebrated as queen now held her as a prisoner condemned to die. Eyewitnesses spoke of her calmness, of the way she looked out at the crowd with a quiet dignity, her eyes clear, her voice steady. She declared herself innocent, prayed for the king's health, and prepared for the end. Even in those final moments, the courtly performance did not cease. Anne played her role to perfection, a queen to the last. When the French executioner struck, it was swift, her head falling with a single blow. Silence followed, the crowd gripped by the suddenness of it, by the terrible finality of seeing the woman who had once commanded England's gaze now reduced to stillness. Anne's fall was not simply the story of a failed queen. It was a lesson etched into the memory of every courtier who remained, that in Henry's world, love could turn to hate in an instant, favor could sour into ruin, and the very traits that made you rise could just as quickly lead to your destruction. Her charm, her laughter, her refusal to be ordinary, all the things that made her irresistible to Henry, became, in the end, the tools used to condemn her. To smile at the wrong man, to jest too sharply, to hold her head too high, all were counted as sins that led her to the scaffold. And after her death, the court did not pause. The silks were cleaned, the music played again, and Henry moved on, taking Jane Seymour as his new bride within days. But the memory of Anne lingered like a ghost in the corridors of the palace. For those who watched her rise and fall, her fate was a warning that beauty, wit, and even the crown itself could not protect against the king's shifting will. In Henry VIII's court, to smile wrong was dangerous, but to shine too brightly was fatal. Anne Boleyn had been both dazzling and doomed, and her story stood as the most chilling reminder of the razor's edge on which every courtier lived. In the shifting theater of Henry VIII's court, where every glance, every phrase, every bow carried the weight of survival, there existed one man whose greatest act was not a flourish of rhetoric or a courtly performance, but silence. Sir Thomas More, scholar, statesman, and once one of the king's closest friends, stood apart from the glistening actors of court life. His end came not because he spoke the wrong words, but because he withheld them. In a realm where smiling wrong could cost you your head, silence itself became a weapon and a death sentence. More had risen not through lineage or military conquest, but through intellect. Born in 1478, the son of a London lawyer, he embodied the spirit of the Renaissance. His mind was as sharp as any blade, his wit famed throughout Europe. He translated the classics, corresponded with Erasmus, and penned Utopia, a vision of a society governed by reason and justice. For years, his learning, humor, and faith earned him admiration not only across the continent, but from Henry himself. The king delighted in conversation with him, often spending hours in lively debate. Henry, who prided himself on his own learning, saw in More a companion of the mind, someone who could match him word for word, thought for thought. But this bond was built on fragile ground, for Henry was not just a man. He was a monarch who demanded obedience not merely in action, but in thought. And Thomas More, for all his brilliance, carried within him an unyielding conscience, one not easily bent by royal command. The test of this friendship, and of More's survival, came in the 1530s. Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn had grown too powerful to ignore. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the queen he had once adored, now felt like a chain. Catherine's failure to give him a male heir gnawed at him, and Henry convinced himself that his union was cursed. He sought an annulment from the Pope. When Rome refused, Henry decided to cut the knot himself. He would break with the Church of Rome, declare himself supreme head of the Church of England, and make his marriage to Anne lawful. This was more than a marital dispute. It was a revolution. For courtiers, bishops, and nobles, the stakes were unbearable. To support the king meant to deny papal authority, to risk excommunication, and to sever ties with centuries of tradition. To oppose the king meant something far worse: charges of treason and the swift fall of the executioner's blade. Thomas More, appointed Lord Chancellor after Cardinal Wolsey's fall, found himself in the crosshairs. At first, he tried to maneuver carefully, resigning his post under the guise of ill health when it became clear Henry's break with Rome was inevitable. He retreated from the glittering court, withdrawing to his home, where he prayed, wrote, and hoped to remain untouched by the storm. But Henry was not a man who tolerated neutrality. Silence, in his eyes, was defiance. When Parliament passed the Act of Succession in 1534, requiring all subjects to swear an oath, recognizing Anne Boleyn as Henry's lawful wife and their children as heirs to the throne, most complied, if reluctantly. To refuse was to brand oneself a traitor. More, however, declined. He would not speak against the king, nor would he endorse the oath. He sought a middle path, neither condemning nor approving. Yet in Henry's world, there was no middle ground. This silence was deafening. It unnerved Henry, enraged his ministers, and sent ripples of fear through the court. For if a man as respected as More refused to swear, what message did that send to others? His very refusal, cloaked in quiet, became louder than any open rebellion. His silence was not submission. It was defiance wrapped in restraint. The court reacted with a mix of disbelief and calculation. Some whispered that More's stubbornness was admirable, a mark of principle in a time of shifting loyalties. Others saw him as a fool who courted death unnecessarily. To Henry and Anne's supporters, his silence was dangerous precisely because it gave nothing to attack. If he had spoken openly against the king, they could have crushed him with words and charges. But silence offered no target. It was an absence that could not be refuted, only feared. Still, the machinery of power found a way. More was summoned to the Tower of London in April 1534. There, he was interrogated, pressured, and urged to comply. The tower's cold walls, damp with centuries of secrets, bore witness to his quiet resistance. More continued to withhold assent, neither openly condemning Henry nor endorsing him. This refusal drove his interrogators to fury. To them, words were proof, and proof meant conviction. But More gave them none. His silence was his shield, and his faith was his anchor. In July 1535, His trial was staged, a performance as much for the public as for justice. The court was filled with tension. More, thin and pale from imprisonment, stood accused of treason for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the church. Witnesses were brought forth, some claiming he had spoken treasonous words, though these testimonies were dubious at best. When allowed to speak, More's defense was simple. He had said nothing. Silence, he argued, could not be twisted into guilt. Qui tacet consentire viditer. He reminded them, a man who is silent is taken to consent. If the law interpreted silence as agreement, how could he be condemned? But in Henry's England, law bent to the will of the crown. The jury, pressured by the looming presence of royal authority, returned a guilty verdict. More was sentenced to death. The court erupted in uneasy silence. Many who watched admired him, but none dared speak. On July 6, 1535, Thomas More walked to the scaffold on Tower Hill. The air was heavy, the crowd restless. He spoke to the people with calm dignity, declaring himself the king's good servant, but God's first. In those words, he captured the essence of his defiance, not rebellion, but conscience. Then he knelt, placed his head upon the block, and the executioner's axe fell. The silence of his death reverberated louder than any speech he could have made. Henry had hoped to silence a critic, but instead he created a martyr. Across Europe, the story of Thomas More's refusal spread. Erasmus wept, the Pope condemned the act, and the name of Thomas More became a symbol of conscience standing against tyranny. Within the court, however, his execution cast a shadow. If a man as close to Henry, as brilliant, as loyal in service, could fall, then no one was safe. Smiles, bows, and flattering words were not enough. Silence itself could be fatal. And so the courtiers learned anew. In Henry's world, it was not only what you said that mattered, but what you refused to say. The story of Thomas More is not simply one of political maneuvering, but of human fragility in the face of power. It illustrates the suffocating atmosphere of Henry's reign, where even the noblest intentions could be twisted into treason. His silence was not cowardice, but an act of profound courage. Yet in the glittering halls of Henry's court, courage was often indistinguishable from folly, and it was always dangerous. For those who remained at court after his death, the lesson was clear. Words must be chosen carefully, smiles rehearsed to perfection, loyalties declared loudly, even if insincerely. But silence could never again be tolerated. Henry's court had no room for neutrality. It demanded performance, and performance without pause. The stage of power required endless lines, endless gestures, endless affirmations of loyalty. To stop, to hesitate, to hold one's tongue was to invite suspicion. And so, in the great theater of Henry VIII's reign, Thomas More's silence echoed long after his body was gone. It whispered through the corridors, reminding every courtier that in this dangerous play, even the absence of words could script one's doom. The glittering halls of Henry VIII's court were not only adorned with tapestries, jewels, and candlelight, they were also filled with masks. Not literal masks, but the kind every courtier wore upon their face each day. They were masks of submission, deference, charm, and loyalty. Beneath them, however, beat hearts of fear, envy, and exhaustion. To survive, one had to be less a human being and more a marionette pulled by unseen strings. To smile when required, to laugh at the king's jests even when they stung, to bow at precisely the right angle, to nod with feigned agreement even when the soul screamed otherwise. In this place, where a wrong word or a wrong glance could lead to ruin, courtiers became puppets performers with no choice but to dance to the music of power. From the moment a young noble was introduced at court, the transformation began. He or she might arrive with eagerness, carrying dreams of serving the crown, of gaining patronage, of basking in the grandeur of royal life. The court dazzled newcomers at first velvet gowns, glittering jewels, banquets groaning with meats and wine, musicians filling the air with song. Yet quickly the truth revealed itself. These luxuries were not gifts freely offered. They were tests, temptations, and traps. Every feast was also a theater, every gathering a performance. Those who failed to play their part, who frowned too long, who spoke too freely, who hesitated in laughter soon, found themselves isolated or, worse, destroyed. It was not enough to be loyal. One had to appear loyal at all times. Not enough to love the king. One had to demonstrate love in every gesture. Not enough to hold one's tongue. One had to hold it in precisely the right way, for silence itself could appear as resistance, as Thomas More discovered. The self, the true self, was dangerous here. To reveal doubt, resentment, or even a flicker of irritation could be fatal. And so, courtiers learned to bury themselves beneath layers of pretense. Imagine the toll of such existence. To rise each morning and clothe not only the body, but the soul in disguise. To polish one's face into an expression of eager devotion. To weigh every word before it left the lips, rehearsing conversations in one's head, replaying past interactions with anxious precision, wondering if a single raised brow or a pause too long might have already sown suspicion. The court was not merely a home of politics. It was a crucible where identity itself melted away. What was left was not a man or woman of flesh and blood, but a puppet whose strings were pulled by power. Some became masters of the art. They practiced their smiles in mirrors, crafted their compliments like weapons, wielded charm as if it were armor. They knew when to step forward, when to step back, when to bend their knee, and when to glance upward. They could flatter with words so sweet they tasted like honey, while inside they cursed the very man they praised. These were the survivors, those who learned to bend until they nearly broke. But even the best could slip, and one slip could end a life. Consider the courtiers who rose under Henry's shifting favor. Today they were confidants, riding beside him in the hunt, sharing his laughter at the feast. Tomorrow, a whisper, a rumor, a badly timed joke, and the same men would be cast out, accused of treason or worse. Their skill at acting, their years of perfect performance, meant nothing if the king's mood turned against them. A puppet was always disposable. For those who endured, the emotional toll was immense. To live each day suppressing natural instincts, to silence one's anger, jealousy, or grief, required more than discipline. It demanded a kind of self-erasure. A man might lose sight of who he truly was beneath the layers of practiced performance. A woman might forget the sound of her own laughter, the feeling of a genuine smile not offered for survival. Identities dissolved into roles until the line between mask and face blurred completely. Letters and diaries from the time, though rare, reveal glimpses of this torment. Courtiers wrote of nights spent sleepless, replaying conversations, worrying if they had bowed deeply enough, if their smile had seemed sincere, if they had agreed too quickly or too slowly with the king's remark. The smallest misstep could gnaw at the mind like a worm in wood, eating away at confidence until all that remained was dread. There were also those who found themselves trapped in contradictions. They might despise a rival, yet be forced to embrace him, to dine with him, to toast his victories. They might disagree passionately with the king's policies, yet be compelled to praise them, to offer words of support while their conscience burned. To betray one's truth became a daily necessity, and with each betrayal, a piece of the soul withered. The puppet life extended beyond words and expressions. Even movements were policed. A glance too sharp, a posture too proud, could be read as arrogance. A sigh, a hesitation, could be branded disloyalty. Courtiers learned to choreograph their bodies as though they were actors upon a stage. When to approach, when to retreat, how to hold a goblet, how to bow just low enough but not too low. For too much eagerness could also be dangerous. Each gesture carried meaning, and every meaning carried risk. What made this existence even more unbearable was its uncertainty. In most lives, there is some safety in effort. Work hard, remain loyal, and one may be rewarded. But at Henry's court, there was no such assurance. A courtier might bow perfectly, smile flawlessly, flatter with exquisite timing, and still fall from grace simply because the king awoke in a foul temper, or because a rival whispered poison into his ear, or because fate decided it was time. The strings could be cut without warning, leaving the puppet collapsed upon the floor. Over time, this world of constant vigilance and suppression created not only individuals broken by fear, but a culture defined by it. The court became a place where authenticity was dangerous, where truth was whispered only in the most private of chambers, if at all. Friendships were fragile, alliances temporary. Even family ties could not be trusted, for survival demanded betrayal when opportunity arose. Fathers might turn against sons, brothers against brothers, if it meant keeping the king's favor. Some few resisted, clinging to their principles even when it doomed them. Men like Thomas More chose silence over false praise, and their refusal cost them their lives. Others, like Anne Boleyn, wielded wit and charm so boldly that it dazzled the king, until the same qualities were used to destroy her. But most courtiers chose the mask, the puppet life, because survival outweighed truth. They became shadows of themselves, actors in a play they could never leave, compelled to smile even as their hearts broke. And so Henry's court glittered with jewels and music, yet underneath lay a deeper truth. It was a theater of puppets each, nobles strung by fear, their strings pulled by the king's favor, their dances dictated by the whims of power. They performed not for applause, but for survival. And when the performance ended, when the strings were cut, they vanished into silence, their true selves long since lost. Under the glittering chandeliers and towering walls of Henry VIII's court, no one could ever fully ignore the silent, looming presence of the scaffold. It stood as both a threat and a promise, a tool of royal justice that doubled as a weapon of fear. To serve in the king's inner circle was to live with one eye fixed on the throne and the other on the executioner's block. Every word, every smile, every glance was a gamble where the stakes were life itself. And should you misplay your hand, the scaffold awaited you, patient and cold, a stage where courtiers were stripped not only of their heads, but of their dignity, legacy, and place in history. Executions in Tudor England were not quiet affairs conducted in the shadows. They were public performances, designed to be lessons written in blood. For the courtiers, the very visibility of death was the point. When the Duke of Buckingham lost his head for treason, or when Anne Boleyn knelt before the French swordsman, their endings were not private matters of justice. They were acts of theater orchestrated by the crown. The scaffold declared to every noble and courtier, proximity to power was a privilege, but that same proximity could turn fatal in an instant. It was a ritual reminder that no one, however beloved or exalted, was safe from the king's wrath. Even when the court seemed alive with music, laughter, and dazzling displays of wealth, the scaffold lingered like a shadow at the feast. Courtiers carried the image of it in their minds as they danced, feasted, and flattered. The thought of the axe or the sword added a sharpness to every bow, a trembling sincerity to every compliment. It wasn't enough to simply serve Henry. One had to serve him flawlessly, for a single mistake could invite whispers of treason, and whispers had a way of turning into charges, trials, and sentences. The block was the punctuation mark that ended careers, friendships, and lives with brutal finality. What made the scaffold even more terrifying was its unpredictability. The charges were often vague, the trials hurried, the outcomes predetermined. Those condemned might be guilty of nothing more than having fallen out of favor or standing in the way of someone more ambitious. The court understood this well, and it bred an atmosphere of both paranoia and submission. A smile could be rehearsed to perfection, but if fortune turned, no skill or charm could prevent the march to the executioner's stage. Men and women alike learned that their bodies were no longer entirely their own. They could be seized, shackled, and displayed as warnings to others. The stories of those who mounted the scaffold became whispered legends in the corridors of court. When Thomas Cromwell, once the king's indispensable minister, was dragged to his death, it was a reminder that even those who seemed untouchable were not safe. The scaffold reduced the mighty to the powerless, reminding courtiers that survival depended not on their own talents alone, but on the king's shifting favor. The message was clear. In Henry's world, loyalty was no shield, brilliance no guarantee, and proximity to the crown no protection. Yet in a paradoxical way, the scaffold gave the court its rhythm. It kept the courtiers compliant, their ambitions sharpened, their flattery more desperate. The ever-present threat of execution bound them together in fear, even as it set them against each other in rivalry. The block was both the king's weapon and his stage prop, the ultimate proof of his power to make or unmake lives at will. Its presence turned the court into a theater where every man and woman performed a role, knowing that the final curtain could fall at any moment, and that curtain was death. This constant reminder of mortality gave Tudor politics its unique intensity. It made every conversation charged, every alliance temporary, and every betrayal inevitable. The executioner's block was not merely a tool of punishment. It was the symbol of Henry's absolute authority, a silent but unyielding overseer of the court's glittering spectacle. And in the hush that fell after the axe struck, or the sword swung, those who remained alive would bow lower, smile wider, and whisper softer, desperate to prove that they would not be the next actors summoned to the blood-stained stage. At the Tudor court, laughter was a dangerous sound. It could be the bright ring of favor, or it could echo like the toll of a death bell. Henry VIII's court, for all its glittering banquets and polished dances, was not a place where mirth flowed freely. It was measured, calculated, and wielded like a weapon. Humor itself carried weight, and the telling of a joke could determine whether a man gained a smile from the king or a swift passage to the Tower. This was because in a world where a glance or an incorrectly timed bow could be taken as treason, words spoken in jest were doubly dangerous. To laugh at the wrong time, to chuckle when the king did not, or worse, still to make the king feel that he himself was the butt of a joke, was to court disaster. Yet one figure existed within this perilous environment who thrived on laughter, whose very survival depended upon pushing boundaries others could not: the royal jester. The jester's role in Henry's court was unlike that of any other courtier. He alone was permitted to mock the king, to jest about his flaws, and to highlight the absurdities of court life. Will Sommers, Henry VIII's famous jester, became not only a figure of amusement, but also an unofficial counselor, able to say what others dared not. While courtiers and nobles scrambled to flatter with carefully rehearsed words, Will Sommers could speak truths dressed in jest. When Henry's weight ballooned and his injuries left him irritable, few dared to speak of it. But Sommers could make a quip about the king's appetite, and instead of a beheading, he received laughter. This strange immunity set the jester apart from the world of constant fear, and yet it was a dangerous immunity at that. For though the jester's words were permitted, they were only safe so long as they pleased the king. A single miscalculation, a single jest that touched a wound too raw, could spell disaster even for the fool. This precarious dance between humor and danger revealed itself most starkly in the behavior of the courtiers around them. When the jester spoke, all eyes flicked toward Henry, waiting to see whether his lips would curl in laughter or tighten in displeasure. A joke was never just a joke. It was a test of the king's mood, a measure of how far favor extended that day. If the king laughed, the court laughed with him, even if the joke itself was thin. If the king's eyes darkened, silence fell like a stone, and the jester's life or reputation hung by a thread. It is difficult to overstate how much weight Henry's reactions carried in these moments. They were not simply about entertainment. They were reminders of absolute power, demonstrations of how even levity was chained to royal will. Outside the jester's privileged place, humor was a minefield for courtiers. A witty remark, the kind that might bring admiration in any other setting, could prove ruinous if the king suspected mockery. To jest about another noble was equally perilous, for rivals lurked in every corner, eager to seize on any slip of the tongue to accuse a man of disrespect. Consider the plight of Sir Nicholas Carew, once a trusted courtier who, though not condemned directly by a joke, fell victim to the ruthless system of enemies, whispering in the king's ear. In such an environment, even the suspicion that one had spoken lightly of the king or his policies could be enough to summon doom. Courtiers learned quickly to police their tongues, to smile politely at humor, but rarely contribute their own. Their survival depended on silence or flattery, never on wit. Yet for all its dangers, humor was necessary. Henry VIII, burdened with the weight of rule and his own tempestuous temper, needed relief. The court needed it too, for without laughter, the glittering halls would have suffocated entirely under paranoia. Thus the jester became not only entertainment, but also a release valve, a strange symbol of truth hidden in mockery. Through laughter, courtiers could find brief respite, though always second-hand through the words of the fool. And even then, that laughter often carried unease, for they knew the fool walked a knife's edge. What makes this balance so chilling is how the jester's privileged role revealed the fragility of everyone else's. If only one man could speak freely, then everyone else was a prisoner of silence. The laughter of the fool became a reminder of their own voicelessness. And though Somers survived Henry's reign unscathed, it was not because the role itself was safe, but because his instinct for when to jest and when to stop was flawless. Another jester, less skilled in reading the king's moods, might not have lived so long. Humor in Henry's court, then, was not mere amusement. It was politics, survival, and risk. To laugh was to reveal loyalty, to remain silent could show disapproval, and to speak in jest was to gamble with one's life. The jester's bells jingled not only with comedy, but with warning, reminding everyone that in a world where a misplaced smile could kill, a misplaced joke could do far worse. Henry's court was not just built on fear of swords and scaffolds. It was built on the fear of laughter itself, and the terrible price of forgetting that only the fool was allowed to laugh too freely. At Henry VIII's court, survival was an art form. To remain in the king's favor for not just months or years, but for decades, required an extraordinary blend of intelligence, observation, luck, and self-control. Unlike those who rose quickly, only to be cut down just as suddenly, the few who managed to remain in Henry's good graces throughout his reign seemed almost superhuman in their ability to anticipate danger, shift allegiances, and endure the turbulence of one of England's most unpredictable monarchs. These men and women became living examples of political survival, proving that the court was not just a place of power and glory, but also of endurance and constant reinvention. Their strategies provide insight into how fragile life at court could be, and how some learned to bend with the storm rather than stand and be broken. The first and most vital strategy was to study Henry himself. To serve him well, you had to understand him not as a king, but as a man. This meant memorizing his moods, his shifting desires, his personal insecurities, and his obsessions. Henry was not a monarch who ruled only through laws and councils. He ruled through his passions. If he adored hunting, you became an expert on hounds and falcons. If he adored music, you learned to play an instrument, or at least pretended to appreciate his performances. If he wanted theological debate, you needed to master scripture. Courtiers who succeeded never assumed they could coast on past favor. They remained students of Henry's personality until the day they died, adjusting themselves constantly to match whatever he valued most in the moment. It was not enough to serve the King of England. You had to serve Henry the man, and Henry the man was endlessly shifting. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, exemplified this adaptability. Norfolk was not necessarily loved by Henry, but he understood how to remain useful. He did not try to dominate the king's will, a mistake that cost men like Thomas Cromwell their lives. Instead, Norfolk learned when to speak, when to flatter, and when to vanish into the background. He carefully shifted alliances, sometimes even betraying his own relatives if it meant saving his skin. While his fortunes rose and fell, and he eventually faced imprisonment late in Henry's reign, his survival through decades of court intrigue was no small feat. Norfolk knew that at Henry's court, loyalty was not to people or even to principle. It was to survival itself. Another key to longevity was aligning with the right factions and knowing when to abandon them. The Tudor court was constantly divided into camps, each vying for influence. Religious conservatives versus reformers, noble families versus ambitious newcomers, old aristocracy versus self-made men elevated by Henry's favor. A courtier had to sense the shifting winds of power and adjust accordingly. To tie yourself too tightly to one camp was to risk destruction when that faction fell. Anne Boleyn's family, for example, rose rapidly as Henry's love for Anne consumed him. But their dependence on her position meant that when she fell, so too did their power. The survivors were those who managed to cross factional lines, making themselves useful to different groups at different times, never committing so deeply that their own fate became tied to another's downfall. Take Sir Thomas Audley, who rose from relatively modest origins to become Lord Chancellor. Audley succeeded not because he was brilliant or particularly charismatic, but because he was flexible. He worked under Cardinal Wolsey, then shifted loyalties to Thomas Cromwell when Wolsey fell. When Cromwell's enemies rose, Audley was careful to maintain distance. He was not flamboyant, nor did he seek to dominate the king's councils. He simply remained useful, competent, and unobtrusive. In this way, he became one of the rare men who held office throughout much of Henry's reign without facing execution. His strategy was simple: never be the brightest star, never be the most controversial figure, but always be indispensable in small, steady ways. Sometimes the best strategy was to disappear altogether. At Henry's court, visibility was a double-edged sword. To be seen by the king could bring rewards, but it also meant exposure to his temper and whims. Those who managed to withdraw quietly during dangerous times often lived to see another day. Courtiers might retreat to their estates when tensions rose, pleading ill health or family duties. By vanishing from the immediate circle of suspicion, they allowed the storm to pass over their heads. While ambition drew many to thrust themselves forward, the wise recognized that survival sometimes meant fading from sight. One striking example is Sir Nicholas Carew, who lived precariously close to power. Carew was a courtier skilled in jousting and military affairs, favored in Henry's early years. But he learned the hard way that proximity to the king could become fatal. Though he ultimately fell and was executed for supposed treason, his earlier career had been marked by careful withdrawals when tensions ran high. Others took note. The art of survival was often knowing when not to be seen, when not to speak, and when not to smile. Even those who thrived for decades endured immense psychological strain. To constantly measure your words, gestures, and allegiances was exhausting. Courtiers became actors, rehearsing lines of flattery, suppressing true opinions, and wearing masks of loyalty, even when their hearts rebelled. To be in favor was not a natural state of being. It was a performance that had to be maintained day and night, year after year. Those who survived longest were not necessarily the most powerful or the most loved, but the most disciplined in their ability to hide themselves behind layers of obedience. Margaret Bryan, governess to Henry's children, provides a fascinating case of long survival. Unlike many courtiers who staked their positions on politics or religion, Bryan's role was maternal, domestic, and relatively apolitical. She cared for the royal children with loyalty, discretion, and humility, managing to retain favor under multiple queens and political upheavals. Her endurance demonstrates another strategy, anchoring oneself in a role that seemed above factional conflict. While others perished in the whirl of intrigue, she endured by presenting herself as useful in a way that transcended Henry's tempers and the rivalries of court. What is most striking about these survival stories is the balance between action and restraint. Too much ambition, and you risked being perceived as a threat. Too little ambition, and you risked being forgotten. The survivors found a delicate middle ground, visible enough to be useful, invisible enough to avoid envy, bold enough to serve the king's desires, cautious enough to retreat when danger came. It was a life lived on a knife's edge, where one wrong smile or one wrong silence could undo decades of careful maneuvering. In the end, survival at Henry VIII's court was not about loyalty, brilliance, or even luck alone. It was about adaptability. The king's moods shifted, factions rose and fell, wives were crowned and executed, policies changed overnight. The only constant was change itself. To endure under such a monarch required a flexibility of spirit that bordered on the inhuman. Those who managed it were not merely courtiers. They were survivors of one of the most dangerous stages in history, where the cost of failure was death, and the reward of success was simply to live another day under Henry's gaze. At Henry VIII's court, the shadow of death was never far from the glittering halls and gilded chambers. The blood of friends, relatives, and even queens stained the polished floors, leaving an atmosphere heavy with fear and suspicion. Each execution, each abrupt disappearance, was a lesson to the courtiers that survival depended not just on skill, intelligence, or loyalty, but on the delicate dance of pleasing a volatile king. The very walls of the court seemed to whisper warnings, carrying tales of those who had smiled at the wrong moment, spoken in the wrong tone, or aligned with the wrong faction. To walk these halls was to navigate an invisible minefield where a misstep could be fatal. The fates of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Thomas Cromwell illustrate the lethal unpredictability of Henry's reign. Anne Boleyn's wit and charm, once her shield, became her undoing as the king's favor shifted, culminating in her execution on charges of treason and adultery. Catherine Howard's youth and indiscretions sealed her fate when accusations of past affairs reached Henry's ears, proving that even queens were not immune to suspicion. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted minister, fell victim to the same mercurial justice, his political enemies leveraging the king's wrath to orchestrate his downfall. Each story became a cautionary tale, reinforcing the reality that no position of power guaranteed safety. The court's bloodshed extended beyond the royals. Noble families were decimated, friends betrayed each other, and alliances dissolved overnight. Courtiers learned that trust was a luxury they could ill afford. Informants and spies, lurking in the shadows, ensured that even private conversations could become weapons against the unsuspecting. The threat was both immediate and psychological. The knowledge that anyone, at any moment, could fall victim instilled constant vigilance and paranoia. Executions were often public and theatrical, designed not only to punish, but to instill terror. The scaffold, always looming nearby, was a grim reminder that Henry's power was absolute. These spectacles created a climate where obedience was enforced through fear, and where courtiers internalized the king's mood as law. A single misstep could erase a life, and each loss served as a lesson to others on the precariousness of existence in such a volatile environment. Beyond the fear of death, the bloodied court left lasting scars on those who survived. Courtiers became masters of disguise, concealing emotions and intentions behind practiced smiles and measured words. Relationships were transactional, often forged out of necessity rather than genuine loyalty or affection. The constant threat of betrayal and loss forced individuals into emotional isolation, where trust was rationed sparingly and survival depended on a keen sense of timing and awareness. The psychological weight of such a court cannot be overstated. Living among constant reminders of mortality, witnessing friends and family fall, and navigating the capricious whims of a king who could swing from benevolent to ruthless in an instant created an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety. Even the most seasoned courtiers developed strategies to manage fear, calculated absences, careful alliances, and a relentless focus on remaining indispensable. Yet no strategy could fully eliminate the ever-present danger. Despite the horror, the bloodied court also produced remarkable adaptability and cunning. Survivors became adept at reading subtle cues, interpreting the king's changing moods, and predicting the rise and fall of factions. Political acumen, emotional intelligence, and flexibility were not merely advantageous, they were essential for survival. These individuals mastered the art of self-preservation, learning when to advance, when to retreat, and when to remain invisible. Henry's court serves as a stark reminder of the lethal interplay between power, fear, and human ambition. Every smile, every word, every alliance carried potential peril. The blood spilled in those opulent halls was not random. It was the outcome of a system where the king's favor dictated life and death. For courtiers, the lesson was clear. Survival depended on vigilance, adaptability, and an almost inhuman ability to navigate a world where loyalty could be weaponized and misjudgment could be fatal. At Henry VIII's court, power was a double-edged sword, dazzling in its promise, yet lethal in its execution. Courtiers lived in a constant paradox. The very favor they craved to secure wealth, influence, and security could just as easily condemn them to a sudden fall. Ambition was both a survival tool and a trap, a seductive force that lured even the wisest into dangerous games of intrigue. Every smile, every whispered compliment, every carefully placed gesture could advance a career or accelerate a death sentence. The tension between desire and dread permeated every corner of the palace, shaping not just politics, but personal relationships, friendships, and family ties. The pursuit of power was intoxicating. Courtiers studied the king's moods, noting which gestures earned laughter and which drew frowns. They aligned themselves with factions, even as they suspected treachery in every whispered conversation. Success was measured by proximity to the monarch. A nod, a glance, a private audience could transform a lowly noble into a trusted advisor. Yet the higher one climbed, the steeper the potential fall. Anne Boleyn's rise illustrates this peril vividly. Her intelligence, charm, and connection to the king elevated her to the pinnacle of court life, only for those same qualities to become reasons for her execution. This dangerous seduction of ambition created a culture of calculated risk. Courtiers learned to balance visibility with discretion. To be ignored was safe, but it offered no influence. To be noticed was perilous, yet it carried the possibility of wealth and status beyond imagination. Many courtiers became masters of reading subtle cues, interpreting micro-expressions, and predicting the king's unpredictable whims. Success demanded not only intelligence, but intuition, emotional control, and a willingness to sacrifice personal bonds. Families were often used as shields or bargaining tools. Alliances shifted constantly, and loyalty was measured by its utility rather than sincerity. The paradox extended beyond the individuals who sought favor. Henry himself relied on the ambitions of his courtiers to maintain control. Their desire for power ensured obedience and amplified the atmosphere of fear, creating a self-reinforcing system where ambition and paranoia fed one another. Every execution, exile, or demotion served as both punishment and lesson, warning others of the deadly stakes involved. Courtiers internalized this lesson deeply. The pursuit of power was inseparable from the risk of annihilation. Psychologically, this environment created tension and profound stress. Courtiers slept with one eye open, measured their words carefully, and scrutinized the gestures of friends and enemies alike. Even minor errors, a missed bow, a glance too long, or an ill-timed joke could set off chains of suspicion. Yet despite the ever-present threat of death, ambition compelled them to play the game. The lure of wealth, influence, and legacy outweighed fear, driving men and women to engage in ever more complex and dangerous maneuvers. Ambition's seduction was not only political, but personal. Courtiers sought recognition, status, and the approval of the king as a validation of their worth. They entered contests of wit, charm, and influence, often at the cost of genuine friendships and moral integrity. Survival required compartmentalization. Private desires were hidden beneath layers of politeness, obedience, and performance. Every interaction was a test, a potential stepping stone or snare, and only those who mastered the subtle art of courtly navigation could hope to endure. Henry's court also highlighted the fine line between brilliance and ruin. The skills that allowed courtiers to rise, intelligence, charisma, decisiveness, were the very qualities that could provoke jealousy or suspicion. Competitors, eager to remove a rival, would exploit any flaw, real or imagined, to prompt the king's wrath. The court became a living arena of psychological warfare, where every decision, gesture, and comment carried weight far beyond its apparent significance. Success was ephemeral, and the shadow of death lingered over every triumph. Ultimately, the paradox of power defined life at Henry's court. Desire and danger were inseparable. Ambition was a constant test, and survival depended on an extraordinary combination of skill, cunning, and luck. Courtiers were ensnared in a world where each move could either secure their place in history or consign them to oblivion. The allure of influence was irresistible, even knowing it could kill. In this gilded cage of danger and opulence, the pursuit of favor became both the greatest temptation and the deadliest hazard, a testament to the lethal charm of ambition in one of history's most infamous courts. Henry VIII's court remains one of the most striking examples in history of how absolute power can shape not only a kingdom, but the very lives of those who serve it. The grandeur of the palace, the glittering garments, the rich feasts, and the artful music masked a reality filled with fear, uncertainty, and mortal danger. Courtiers who walked these halls lived in a constant state of calculation, knowing that even the smallest misstep, a poorly timed word, a glance that lingered too long, a joke misunderstood, could result in exile, imprisonment, or execution. Every day, the shadow of the scaffold loomed as a grim reminder that Henry VIII's favor was fleeting, and that the slightest mistake could be fatal. The legacy of fear extended beyond the immediate consequences of disobedience. It shaped behavior, relationships, and culture, creating a court where loyalty was transactional and friendship was suspect. Courtiers became adept at reading subtle cues, navigating rivalries, and performing carefully choreographed displays of obedience and charm. Ambition, intelligence, and wit were as much tools of survival as they were weapons in the endless game of influence. This pervasive anxiety influenced every interaction. Who spoke to whom, how one walked into a room, how one smiled or bowed. Even the most confident nobles learned to temper their impulses, as any misjudgment could provoke the king's wrath. The court's legacy also reflects the broader dangers of concentrated power. Henry's absolute authority allowed him to wield life and death as easily as he commanded policy or enacted law. His courtiers internalized this dynamic, creating a self-perpetuating system of obedience and paranoia. Individuals were compelled to monitor not only their own behavior, but the behavior of everyone around them, fostering a culture in which suspicion and manipulation became survival strategies. Trust became rare, and alliances were fragile, shifting with the king's mood or the latest rumor. The political theater of the court thus intertwined with personal survival, making every interaction a high-stakes gamble. The stories of Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and countless other courtiers illustrate how quickly favor could transform into fatal judgment. Anne's charm and intelligence, once her greatest assets, were later cited as threats, leading to her downfall. Thomas More's principled silence and act of conscience resulted in execution. Their fates underscore the harsh reality of life at court. Morality, loyalty, or even intellect could not protect one from the caprice of absolute authority. These narratives highlight not just individual tragedies, but the systemic danger of a court ruled entirely by the personal whims of a single monarch. Beyond the historical facts, Henry VIII's court serves as a psychological study in fear, ambition, and human behavior under extreme pressure. The constant surveillance, the pressure to anticipate the king's desires, and the deadly stakes of failure produced an environment of acute stress, where mental acuity was as critical as physical presence. Courtiers learned to suppress emotions, conceal intentions, and perform convincingly in every interaction. Humor, wit, and charm became weapons as much as shields, while miscalculations could lead to sudden and irreversible consequences. In this high-pressure environment, success was a precarious balance between visibility and discretion. Despite the danger, the pursuit of favor remained irresistible. Courtiers craved recognition, wealth, and influence, and the potential rewards of securing the king's favor often outweighed the risks. Ambition drove them to navigate intrigues, manipulate factions, and cultivate advantageous relationships. Even in an environment saturated with fear, the human desire for status and power persisted, illustrating the enduring tension between self-preservation and aspiration. The very qualities that made courtiers successful: intelligence, boldness, and strategic thinking also heightened the risk of attracting deadly scrutiny. Henry VIII's court, therefore, can be seen as a cautionary tale of absolute power and its consequences. It exemplifies how authority concentrated in the hands of one individual can reshape social structures, personal behavior, and cultural norms. The interplay of fear, ambition, and survival created a society in miniature, where every gesture was scrutinized and every word could be weaponized. The psychological and political lessons extend beyond the Tudor era, offering insight into the enduring dynamics of power, obedience, and human ambition. Even centuries later, the echoes of that court continue to fascinate historians, psychologists, and storytellers. The tales of treachery, loyalty, sudden downfall, and survival resonate because they illuminate the extremes of human behavior under coercive power. They remind us that beauty and luxury can mask danger, and that charm and intelligence, while valuable, are never guarantees of safety. The court was a crucible, forging some into influential statesmen while consuming others entirely, leaving only shadows and cautionary lessons in its wake. This enduring legacy emphasizes that absolute power is rarely benign. It distorts relationships, incentivizes duplicity, and places lives at constant risk. For those who lived within its walls, every smile, every word, every gesture was a potential turning point, a choice between advancement or annihilation. Henry VIII's court was not merely a political institution, but a psychological arena where fear, ambition, and survival were inextricably linked, teaching timeless lessons about the human cost of unchecked authority. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the perilous world of Henry VIII's court, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more historical insights, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that uncovers the secrets of the past. Comment below with which story shocked you the most, and share this video with friends who love history. Thank you for watching and stepping inside one of the most dangerous courts in history, where even a simple smile could seal your fate.